My cousins dragged me into court, their faces a perfect mask of concern as their lawyer called me senile. They saw a confused old woman, all alone, a simple problem to be managed right out of my own home. What they didn't know, as they sat there smiling and waiting for the new judge, was that they were in my son's courtroom. My house was not a quiet house. It groaned in the windy months and ticked in the summer heat. The oak floors in the hallway sang their own tune under my slippers, a familiar creak, squeak, creak that I'd come to count as company. My late husband Frank always said the place had good bones. He'd built the tall bookshelves in the living room with his own hands, and every Tuesday I ran a soft cloth over the wood. The scent of lemon oil and old paper filled the air, and for a moment it felt like he was still in the next room, about to call out for his reading glasses. His armchair, a worn-down plaid wingback, sat opposite mine by the cold fireplace. Mine held the permanent impression of my body, but his was just empty. It had been empty for 8 years, but I still caught myself glancing at it, expecting to see him looking over the edge of his newspaper. The silence was different now. After Frank passed, it was heavy, but after my son Marcus stopped calling, the silence became hollow. I stood in the kitchen, the black and white linoleum cool under my feet. On the counter sat the heavy, almond-colored mixer Frank had bought me for our 10th anniversary. I hadn't used it in months. Marcus used to love it when I baked, especially chocolate chip cookies. He'd sit at the small breakfast table, his 9-year-old legs swinging, chattering about school while he tried to steal bits of raw dough. The last postcard was pinned to the corkboard by the phone. A picture of a bridge in Seattle. It was 3 years old. Working on a big case, Mom. Things are complicated. I'll call when I can. Love you. Before that, a brief call from Oregon. Before that, years of silence. Our last big fight hung in the air like dust motes, visible only when the light hit them just right. It was right after he passed the bar exam over a decade ago. Frank and I were beaming, so proud. We'd assumed he'd join the local practice, maybe find a nice girl. This is your home, son. Frank had boomed, clapping him on the back. Marcus had stiffened. It's your home, Dad, not mine. His voice had been quiet, but it cut deeper than any shout. He left a week later, chasing some high-powered job in a city I'd never seen. He came back for Frank's funeral, a tall stranger in a perfectly tailored black suit. He held my hand at the graveside, his own hand firm but cold. I have to go back, Mom. I'm sorry. And just like that, he was gone again. The lost son, as the neighbors politely called him. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway snapped me back to the present. It wasn't the postman's familiar rattle. This was a heavier, slower sound, an invasion. I peered through the lace curtains of the living room window. A sleek silver car I didn't recognize was parked behind my old station wagon. My cousin David and his wife Karen climbed out. I hadn't seen them since the funeral, and even then. They had only stayed long enough to sign the book and take a sandwich for the road. Karen, thin and sharp in a navy pantsuit, looked up at the house, her nose wrinkled. She pointed at the porch swing, and David, soft and uneasy, pulled out his phone and took a picture. My stomach twisted. This was not a social call. I smoothed the front of my apron, my hands feeling suddenly stiff. I walked to the front door, the floorboards groaning their warning. I opened it just as Karen was about to press the bell. "Elara, dear." She trilled, her voice too loud for the quiet afternoon. She pushed past me into the foyer, not waiting for an invitation. Her perfume, a sharp, cloying floral, instantly smothered the familiar scent of lemon oil. My goodness. This place is, well, it's exactly as I remember it. She ran a long, painted fingernail along the flocked wallpaper in the hall, her nail clicking against the plaster. She looked at her fingertip as if checking for dust. David shuffled in behind her, giving me an awkward one-armed hug that felt more like a pat-down. "Good to see you, Alara. We were just in the area. Thought we'd check in." "I'm fine, David. Hello, Karen," I said, my voice steady. "I wasn't expecting company." "Oh, we know, dear," Karen said, already drifting into the living room. Her heels clicked sharply on the hardwood floors. She stopped at Frank's bookshelves. "Still holding on to all these old books, I see. Must be a chore to keep clean." "I manage," I said quietly. "Of course you do," David mumbled, lingering by the door. "It's just, we're concerned, Alara. You're all alone here, in this big old house. It's a lot to handle." "I'm not alone," I said, my hands gripping the fabric of my apron. "I'm independent." "There's a difference." Karen turned, her smile fixed and bright. It didn't reach her eyes, which were scanning the room, taking inventory. "Of course. It's just, you're not getting any younger. The property taxes, the upkeep, and with Marcus, well, with Marcus gone." There it was. The word "gone" dropped into the conversation like a stone. "Marcus is not gone," I said, the words sharper than I intended. "He's busy." Karen's plastic smile widened. "Busy, yes, for 12 years. Alara, we just want to talk. We want to help." The word "help" landed in the quiet room with a thud. It didn't sound like kindness. It sounded like a key turning in a lock. "Help with what exactly?" I asked, pulling my apron tighter. Karen sighed, a little puff of impatience. "Oh, Alara, don't be difficult. Let's go to the kitchen, shall we? We can make some tea and have a proper talk." She didn't wait for me. She walked right past me, her sharp heels clicking a rhythm of ownership on the oak floors. I followed her, my soft slippers silent. I felt a chill as she entered my kitchen. This was my space. This was where I still talked to Frank, where I waited for calls from Marcus. Karen, however, saw only flaws. "My goodness," she said, stopping by the breakfast table. "This is all so dated." She ran her hand over the smooth, almond-colored finish of my heavy stand mixer. "Does this old thing even work anymore?" "It works perfectly," I said. My voice was tight. I had been planning to use it this afternoon. I was thinking of making some chocolate chip cookies. They were always Marcus's favorite. "Cookies?" Karen laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "Dear, you really shouldn't be operating heavy equipment like this. You could slip. You could fall. No one would find you for days." David, who had been hovering in the doorway, finally shuffled into the room. He looked uncomfortable, but he nodded in agreement. "That's what we mean, Alara. That's why we're here." "We're worried." He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out several sheets of paper, neatly folded. He placed them on the table, right on the spot where Marcus used to do his homework. We had our lawyer draw this up," David said, his eyes on the paper, not on me. He pushed it toward me. I looked down. My reading glasses were on the counter by the sink, but I didn't need them to read the large, bold letters at the top. Durable power of attorney. A cold wave started in my stomach and washed through my entire body. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. The formica felt smooth and slick beneath my fingers. "What is this?" I whispered, though I already knew. "It's just a precaution, Alara," Karen said, her voice switching back to that false, sweet tone. "It's a safety net. It just gives us the ability to manage things for you. Pay your bills. Make necessary repairs to the property. Make sure you're taken care of, for your own good. Make decisions about my property." I looked up from the paper, past them, through the doorway into the living room. I could see the edge of Frank's empty armchair. "The house is just too much for you," David said, gaining a little confidence. "It's falling apart. We found a lovely retirement community, Alara. Willow Creek. It's managed. You'd have friends. You'd be safe. And the equity from this house," he paused. "It's a fortune. It could pay for that care for the rest of your life. So that was it. They weren't just looking at the house. They had already spent the money. You want me to leave my home, I stated. It wasn't a question. We want you to be realistic. Karen snapped, her patience gone. Marcus isn't here. He hasn't been here in years. He's not coming back. We are the only family you have left who cares. The mention of my son's name felt like a slap. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it filled the kitchen. Ilara, just sign the paper, David pleaded. It's for the best. No. I pushed the document back across the table. It slid and hit his hand. This is my house. Frank and I built our lives here. Marcus grew up here. I am not leaving, and I am not signing anything. Not for you, Karen's face hardened. The mask of concern melted away, revealing something cold and ugly underneath. We were afraid you'd be this way. Stubborn, sentimental. She snatched the papers off the table and folded them precisely. We saw the mail piled up in the hall, Ilara. We saw the crack in the front step. You can't cope. I can cope, I said, my voice rising. This is my home and you are not welcome in it anymore. Please leave. David looked shocked that I'd raised my voice. He started to stammer. Now, Ilara, You heard her, David. Karen cut him off. Let's go. She turned back to me, her eyes narrow. We didn't want it to come to this. We were trying to be nice, but if you won't be reasonable, you leave us no choice. We will have to take other steps. What steps? I demanded. You can't just throw me out of my own home. Karen smiled. That same thin, terrible smile I'd seen from the window. A judge will see it differently. A judge will see a confused old woman living alone in a deteriorating property, a danger to herself. A judge will see us, her loving family, ready to help. She turned and walked out of the kitchen. Her heels clicked down the hall. Click, 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 all the way to the front door. David gave me one last apologetic look before scurrying after her. I heard the front door open, then slam shut. The sound of their car engine starting was a relief. I stood alone in my kitchen for a long time. The silence they left behind was worse than before. It felt sharp. I looked at the mixer on the counter, its smooth almond surface. I had no desire to make cookies anymore. I walked to the front door and twisted the deadbolt. The thud of the lock sliding into place was small, but it was the only sound in the house. For 3 days, the house held its breath. I kept the deadbolt on, even in the bright afternoon. Every time I heard a car on the gravel road, my heart jumped into my throat. I didn't bake. I didn't dust. I just sat in my chair, staring at Frank's, and listened to the silence. On the 4th day, I heard the metallic scrape of the mail slot, followed by the soft thud of letters hitting the floor in the foyer. I walked slowly. My feet knew the path. Bills, a seed catalog for a garden I wouldn't plant, a flyer for a pizza place I'd never order from. And then I saw it. A thick, cream-colored envelope. My name and address were typed. The return address, in stark black letters, was the office of the county clerk. My hand started to shake. I picked it up. It felt heavy, important. I walked back to the living room and sat down in my own chair, the one with the floral cushions. I couldn't bring myself to sit in Frank's. I picked up his old letter opener from the side table, the one with the carved wooden handle, and slit the envelope. The sound of the paper tearing was too loud. I unfolded the document. My eyes scanned the page, catching on words I didn't want to understand. Petition. In the matter of Ilara Thorne, hearing to determine competency. Petitioners, David Miller, Karen Miller. Karen's voice echoed in my head. A judge will see it differently. They hadn't been bluffing. They had actually done it. They had filed a petition to have me declared incompetent. My breath caught. I found the date for the hearing. It was next Tuesday, less than a week away. A cold, sharp panic, unlike any I had ever known, seized me. This was real. They were really going to drag me into a courtroom and tell a stranger that I was crazy, that I couldn't be trusted with my own home, my own life. Marcus, I whispered. The name was a reflex, a prayer. I scrambled up and went to the small desk by the kitchen phone. The 3-year-old postcard from Seattle was still pinned to the corkboard. I'll call when I can. When, Marcus? I whispered at the picture of the bridge. When? I pulled open the drawer beneath the phone, the one filled with old address books, rubber bands, and pens that didn't work. My fingers fumbled, finally landing on a thin blue address book from more than 10 years ago. I flipped to M. His handwriting was there, a youthful, loopy scrawl. First job, big shot lawyer. He'd written the number himself. I picked up the heavy black receiver of the landline, the plastic cool against my ear. The familiar dial tone hummed. With a trembling finger, I slowly pressed the numbers. It rang once, twice. Then a sharp click. A recorded voice, smooth and impersonal, said, "We're sorry. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. Please check the number and try again." I hung up, my hand feeling heavy. I found another number, a cell phone, scribbled on a piece of notepad paper tucked into the book's spine. I dialed that one. It rang, and rang, and rang. It felt like an eternity. Finally, it clicked over. The subscriber you are trying to reach has not set up a mailbox. Please try again later. He was gone. The numbers were dead. The postcard was just a piece of paper. David and Karen were right. He wasn't coming back. I was completely and totally alone. The tears came then, hot and angry. I slumped against the wall, the phone still in my hand. They were going to win. They were going to put me in that Willow Creek place and sell Frank's bookshelves and my mixer and his empty chair. I looked across the room at that chair. The plaid fabric was faded on the arms where Frank used to rest his hands. It was quiet, but it wasn't weak. It was steadfast. "You're stronger than you think, Alara." I could almost hear Frank's voice, a low rumble from that very chair. "Always have been. Don't let those vultures push you around." The tears stopped. A new feeling, slow and hot, replaced the cold panic. It was anger. This wasn't just my house. This was my life. This was Frank's memory. I would not let them take it. I would not let them call me confused and erase me. I stood up straight. I looked at the court summons again, forcing myself to read the smaller print. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one may be appointed for you, or you may contact legal aid. I remembered seeing a small advertisement on the local news channel. Seniors Legal Services. My hands were steady now. I picked up the heavy phone book from the shelf under the desk. I flipped through the pages, found the number, and dialed. A kind, professional voice answered on the second ring. Legal Services. How can I help you? My own voice was rough, but it didn't waver. My name is Alara Thorne. My cousins are. They're trying to take my house. They say I'm incompetent. I have a court date for next Tuesday. The county courthouse was not like my home. The air smelled wrong, a sharp chemical smell of old floor wax, stale coffee, and the faint, dusty scent of too many people's troubles. The floors were marble, and every sound, a cough, a door closing, a woman's sharp heels, echoed in the high-ceilinged hallway. The benches were hard, polished wood, cold through my thin coat. Mrs. Thorne. I looked up. A young man with a kind face and a slightly rumpled suit was holding out his hand. His briefcase was brown leather, scuffed at the corners and overflowing with papers. "I'm Ben Carter," he said, his voice quiet and earnest. "From legal services. I'm so sorry we're only meeting in person now. It's been a busy week." "Hello, Mr. Carter," I said, taking his hand. His handshake was firm but quick, as if he was nervous. "Please call me Ben." He sat beside me on the hard bench. "It's going to be okay. I've read your file. This is a classic overreach. We just need to go in there and show the judge who you really are. Just be honest. You're perfectly capable." He sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I wanted to believe him. "Thank you, Ben," I said. Before he could reply, I saw them. David and Karen were already there, sitting across the hall. They weren't looking at me. They were huddled with a man I hadn't seen before. He was the opposite of Ben. His suit was dark gray, perfectly tailored, and looked expensive. His hair was slicked back, and as he spoke he flashed a set of very white teeth. He radiated a slick, cold confidence. Karen, wearing a stiff new blazer, was smiling. She looked pleased, satisfied. David just looked gray and uneasy, staring at his shoes. As I watched, Karen leaned in closer to her lawyer. "I just want this over with," I heard her whisper, her voice carrying across the hall. "The realtor is already asking about staging the living room." Ben Carter stiffened beside me. "Staging?" he muttered, scribbling a note on his legal pad. "They haven't even won, and they're already selling the furniture." My stomach turned to ice. They weren't just planning to sell the house. They were planning to erase me from it. A moment later, a heavy door opened and a bailiff leaned out. "Case 47B, in the matter of Alara Thorne." Ben helped me up. "Deep breath, Mrs. Thorne. We're ready." The courtroom was even more intimidating than the hallway. It was huge, paneled in dark wood from floor to ceiling. It felt like being at the bottom of a well. We sat at a long table on the left. David, Karen, and their slick lawyer, Mr. Huxley, sat at the table on the right. An older judge with a weary face sat high above us on the bench. He looked at a stack of papers and sighed. "Let's get this moving. Mr. Huxley, you represent the petitioners." "Yes, Your Honor," Huxley said. He stood up, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He was a performer, and this was his stage. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and full of false sympathy. "My clients, David and Karen Miller, are here today out of profound, reluctant concern. Their cousin, Mrs. Alara Thorne," he motioned to me as if I were a piece of evidence, "is, regrettably, in a state of advanced cognitive decline." Ben started to rise. "Objection, Your Honor. That's a—" "Sit down, counselor," the judge grumbled, not even looking up. "It's an opening statement. Let him talk." Ben sat, his face flushing. Huxley smiled. "Mrs. Thorne lives in a large, deteriorating property all alone. The house is in disrepair. She lives in isolation, a prisoner of the past." He held up a photo. It was the picture David had taken of my porch. She has one son, a lost son, who has not had contact with her in over a decade. She is, quite simply, a danger to herself. My clients, her only caring family, are here to provide the care she refuses to accept. I gripped the edge of the table. My knuckles were white. The wood felt smooth and cold. Every word was a twist of the knife. I looked at David, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. Karen, however, was staring right at me, her expression a perfect mask of concern. "We are petitioning for power of attorney as an act of kindness, Your Honor," Huxley was saying. "A necessity to manage her assets before she—" "Counselor," the old judge interrupted, his voice like gravel. "That's enough for now." Huxley stopped, surprised. The judge looked up at the large round clock on the back wall. "My retirement was official as of 9 a.m. I've only been here this morning to clear the preliminary motions." He gathered his papers. "The new presiding judge for the district is taking this bench. Now. He will hear your case." A ripple of confusion went through the room. Huxley looked annoyed. Ben looked terrified. A new judge? We hadn't prepared for this. Just then, the heavy oak doors behind the bench opened. All rise! The bailiff's voice boomed, sharp and sudden. We all stood up. My knees were shaking. This was it. This was the stranger who would decide my life. A tall man in a new, crisp black robe walked in, carrying a stack of files. He moved with a quiet, undeniable authority. He sat down in the high-backed leather chair, which groaned under his weight. He looked serious, focused on the papers in front of him. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep and clear. "I am Judge Thorne. Let's begin with the first case on the docket. Case 47B, petition for conservatorship over Ilara Thorne." He paused. The name hung in the air. His head snapped up, his eyes scanning the room. He looked at Huxley. He looked at David and Karen, who were smiling their fake, concerned smiles, and then his eyes moved to my table. He looked right at me. His face, which had been a mask of judicial impartiality, went pale. The pen in his hand was still. The entire courtroom was silent. "Mom?" he said, his voice echoing in the vast wooden room. "What are you doing here? Who are these people?" The word "Mom" echoed in the high-ceilinged room. For a second, I thought I had imagined it. That the stress and the fear had finally made me hear things. But then I looked up. The man on the bench. It was Marcus. He was older, of course. His dark hair was shorter, with a little gray at the sides. There were serious lines around his eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. But it was him. It was the face I had been looking for in my memory for 12 years. "Marcus?" I whispered. My own voice sounded strange, like it belonged to someone else. He was staring at me, his shock as deep as my own. The entire courtroom was frozen. I could feel the silence, heavy and absolute. Then I heard a small, strangled sound from the table next to me. I turned my head. David's face was the color of spoiled milk. His mouth was open, his eyes wide with a kind of terrified disbelief. Karen was worse. Her perfectly applied lipstick was smeared where she'd pressed her hand to her mouth. Her eyes darted from Marcus on the bench to me and back to Marcus. The plastic smile was gone, replaced by a raw, naked panic. Mr. Huxley, their slick lawyer, was the first to move. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. "Your Honor," he stammered, his voice losing its smooth confidence. This is highly irregular. This is the petitioner, Mrs. Thorne. We are here for a competency hearing." He said competency hearing, as if the words themselves would fix this. I watched my son's face. The shock was fading, and something else was replacing it. Something I remembered from a long time ago, from the day he'd stood up to a high school bully. It was a cold, still anger. He looked from Huxley to David and Karen, and then his eyes landed back on me. "A competency hearing," Marcus repeated. His voice was no longer the impartial tone of a judge. It was low, personal, and dangerous. "For my mother." David started shaking his head, trying to speak. We didn't know," he sputtered, looking at Marcus like he was a ghost. "We thought she was alone. She never mentioned. We didn't know you didn't know I was what?" Marcus's voice cut through David's excuse like a blade. "That I existed? Or just that I would show up?" He stood up, towering over the bench. He looked at me, and for just 1 second, the judge was gone, and he was just my son. His eyes were filled with a pained question. Then he hit the gavel. The single sharp crack made me jump. "Bailiff," he ordered, his voice flat and full of an authority that had nothing to do with me. "Find Judge Chen. Inform her I am recusing myself from this case due to an immediate and profound personal conflict. This hearing is suspended." He didn't wait for an answer. He was already unzipping his heavy black robe. The sound of the zipper was loud in the dead quiet room. He let the robe fall onto the back of his chair, leaving it there like an empty shell. He was just a man in a white shirt and a dark tie, and he was walking down the steps from the dais. He didn't even look at Huxley, David, or Karen as he passed their table. He walked straight to me. Ben Carter, my young lawyer, was staring, his mouth open. Marcus stopped right in front of me. He knelt just a little so he was level with me in my chair. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked, his voice quiet, for me alone. The tears I had refused to shed for a week finally came. They burned my eyes. "They want my house, Marcus," I whispered, my voice thick. "They said I was senile. They want to sell my house." They were already talking to a realtor. I watched something in his eyes break and then harden into granite. He put his hand on my shoulder. His hand was warm, not cold like it had been at Frank's funeral. It was strong and steady. "Not anymore," he said, his voice low. "Not ever." He stood up, pulling me gently to my feet. He wrapped one arm around my shoulders, tucking me against his side. He turned us away from the petitioners, away from the judge's bench, and toward the exit. "Marcus, wait!" Karen's voice, high and pleading, cut through the air. "We're family! We were just trying to help." Marcus stopped. He didn't turn around, but I could feel the anger coming off him. "You stopped being family when you filed this petition," he said, his voice carrying back to every corner of the room. "And you will be hearing from my lawyer." He pushed open the heavy courtroom doors, and we stepped out into the echoing hallway. He didn't let go of me. For the first time in a week, I felt like I could breathe again. I was holding onto my son's arm. I wasn't alone. The heavy courtroom door clicked shut behind us. The sound was final. It echoed in the high, empty marble hallway, sealing David and Karen and their shock inside that room. Marcus's arm was solid around my shoulders, and the warmth from his body seeped through my thin coat. He steered me toward the elevators. The hallway was cold, but I felt safe. "Mrs. Thorne, Judge, Marcus." We turned. Ben Carter, my young lawyer, was hurrying after us, his scuffed briefcase flapping open. He looked out of breath and completely stunned. "That was—" He started, then just shook his head, looking at Marcus with a kind of awe. "The petition will be dismissed, of course, with prejudice. They won't ever be able to file again. They'll be lucky if Mr. Huxley isn't sanctioned." "Thank you, Mr. Carter," Marcus said, his voice steady, "for taking care of my mother. Send your bill to my office." "Oh, no," Ben stammered, his face turning red. "I'm legal aid. I couldn't." "Send it," Marcus repeated. It wasn't a suggestion, but it wasn't unkind. He pressed the elevator button, and the doors slid open. The ride down was silent. We stepped out of the courthouse and into the bright, cold November air. The wind was sharp, but it felt good to breathe. Marcus led me to a new-looking dark blue car. It was so clean, it shined. When he opened the door for me, the smell that wafted out was new leather. It was so different from my old station wagon, which still smelled faintly of Frank's maps and the lemon polish I used on the dash. He got in the driver's side and started the engine. It made only a quiet hum. He drove carefully, his hands on the wheel. They were strong hands, like Frank's, but smoother. We drove through the familiar streets of my town, but I felt like I was seeing them for the first time. The silence in the car wasn't the hollow, lonely silence of my house. It was a heavy, waiting silence, filled with 12 years of unsaid words. I looked at Marcus's profile. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. I could see he was still angry. He turned onto our gravel road. The sound of the tires crunching was the same sound that had warned me about David and Karen. This time, though, it felt like a welcome. He parked right behind my old station wagon. We both sat there for a moment, just looking at the house. The paint was peeling a little on the trim, and the crack in the front step was still there. But it didn't look like a deteriorating property, as Mr. Huxley had said. It looked like home. "Let's go inside, Mom," Marcus said, his voice soft. He got out and came around to open my door, just as he had in the courtroom. He walked with me up the path. I reached into my coat pocket for my keys, but he was already pulling his own key ring from his pocket. He sorted through several new, shiny keys until he found one that was old and brass. My house key. He'd kept it. After all these years, he still had his key. He slid it into the lock. The click of the deadbolt sliding back was a good, solid sound. He pushed the door open for me and let me go in first. The house was quiet, but it was my quiet. It smelled of lemon oil, old books, and the faint, sweet scent of the apple I'd left in a bowl on the counter. Marcus stepped in behind me and closed the door. He leaned against it for a second and breathed in deeply. "It smells exactly the same," he whispered. I didn't go to the living room, to the empty chairs. I went straight to the kitchen. It was the heart of the house. It always had been. I sat down at the small breakfast table in my usual spot. My hands were shaking again, but not from fear. Marcus followed me, but he didn't sit. He stood by the counter, his hand resting on the smooth, almond-colored surface of my stand mixer. He just looked at it for a long moment. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice rough. "I am so sorry." "You didn't call," I said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just the truth, a fact that had been sitting in my heart for years. The postcard from Seattle, that was 3 years ago. I kept it. I looked at the corkboard by the phone, where it was still pinned. I thought you were gone, Marcus. I thought I'd lost you, too." He closed his eyes. He looked tired. "I know," he said. "After the fight, after Dad died, I just buried myself in work. I was a prosecutor. It was consuming. I kept telling myself I was too busy, that I'd call next week or next month." He looked at me, and his eyes were full of a deep shame that hurt me to see. And then 1 year turned into 2, and 2 turned into 5. And then, I didn't know how to call. What could I possibly say? "Sorry I've been gone for 8 years. It felt too big, too—" I was ashamed. "You could have said hello," I whispered. "I know." He walked over and finally sat down in the other chair, the one he used to sit in as a boy, his legs swinging. "I was wrong. I was so wrong, Mom. I got the appointment, the judgeship, 6 months ago. The transfer to this district. I was going to surprise you. I just moved into my new apartment last week. I was going to drive here this weekend. I never imagined." He looked around the kitchen, his eyes landing on the old corkboard. He saw the postcard of the bridge. "I'm home, Mom," he said quietly. "I'm not busy anymore." I looked at his hand on the table, then at the mixer on the counter. "I was going to make cookies," I said, my voice watery. "The day they came, the chocolate chip ones." A small, tired smile touched his face. The first real smile I'd seen on him in 12 years. "I remember," he said. "I always tried to steal the dough." "I remember," I said back. The kitchen felt warm. I stood up from the breakfast table. The ache in my knees from the hard courtroom bench was starting to fade. I walked to the pantry and pulled out the big bag of flour, the canister of sugar, and the small bottle of vanilla. "We should make those cookies then," I said. Marcus watched me. I set the heavy ingredients on the counter one by one. I turned to get the large, yellow mixing bowl from the top shelf of the cupboard. I reached for it, my arm straining just a little, but a hand reached past me. "I've got it, Mom," Marcus said. He was so tall. He reached the bowl easily, without even stretching, and set it on the counter with a soft thunk. It was the same way he used to do it when he was a teenager and had suddenly shot up past my height. I went to the refrigerator for the butter and eggs. When I turned back, he was already at the counter, untwisting the wire on the bag of brown sugar. "Still 2 cups of flour, right?" he asked. 2 1/4, I corrected him gently. "And don't pack the brown sugar too hard." We fell into an old rhythm, as if 12 years had been 12 minutes. I measured the flour and baking soda. He cracked the eggs, tapping them perfectly on the side of the bowl. The smell of vanilla and sweet brown sugar began to fill the kitchen, pushing out the last of the stale, cold fear from the morning. I locked the bowl into the stand. I flipped the switch, and the heavy almond-colored mixer whirred to life. The sound was loud and comforting. It was the sound of a working kitchen, a living home. We watched it turn, mixing the butter and sugar just as we had done 100 times before. "My new apartment is quiet," Marcus said, his voice just loud enough to be heard over the mixer. "All white walls. It doesn't smell like anything." "This old house is never quiet," I said, adding the flour. "The floors creak. The pipes knock. I talked to your father's chair." I stopped, feeling my face heat up. I hadn't meant to say that last part. Marcus stopped the mixer. He looked at me, his face serious. "I should have been here, Mom. When he died, I should have stayed." "We were both angry," I said, looking down at the dough. "Your father was stubborn. And you are just like him." I scraped the sides of the bowl with a spatula and handed it to him. He knew what to do. He dumped in the bag of chocolate chips. "I put in an offer on a house," he said, stirring the chips in by hand. "Last week, on Sycamore Street. It's got a yard." My hand, which was holding the cookie sheet, stilled. Sycamore Street was 3 blocks away. "It's close," I said, my voice quiet. "It's close," he agreed. We dropped spoonfuls of dough onto the baking sheets. We didn't talk. We just worked, the thud of the spoon against the bowl a steady, shared sound. I slid the first 2 sheets into the hot oven. We moved to the living room to wait. The timer on the stove ticked, a small sound in the distance. The sharp smell of lemon oil on the bookshelves was already blending with the warm, rich smell of baking cookies. I sat in my chair. Marcus looked at his father's empty plaid chair for a long moment. I thought he might sit in it, but he didn't. Instead, he sat down on the stone hearth of the fireplace, his back against the bricks. So he was sitting near my feet. "This is good," he said, just looking at the room, at the shelves Frank built. I have a lot of vacation time saved up, Mom, a lot. I was thinking I could take a few weeks off. Before I start hearing cases." "Oh?" "That crack on the front step looks bad," he said, turning to look at me. "And the paint on the trim is peeling. We could fix it. Together. We." The word was as warm as the air coming from the oven. The timer buzzed. A few minutes later, we were back in the kitchen. The wire racks were full. Marcus, without asking, poured 2 glasses of milk. He slid a warm, melted cookie onto a small plate and handed it to me. He took one for himself. He leaned against the counter, and I sat at the table. We ate in comfortable silence. The cookie was warm and sweet, and it tasted like home. I looked across the kitchen, through the doorway, into the living room. I could just see the plaid wingback chair. It was still empty, but the house wasn't. The house was full of the smell of chocolate and vanilla. It was full of the sound of my son here in the kitchen. The house was safe. I was safe. And Marcus, my lost son, was finally home.